Donald Trump, the US president-elect, has been critical of wind energy, and he's seen as not a huge fan of investing more in renewable power. And he also is seen as a friend to oil and gas production, certainly south of the border. But our guest says a clean energy transformation train has already left the station. We're joined by Thomas Timmins, Canadian energy sector group leader at Gowling WLG, the law firm. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Andy. Great to be back.
But before we talk about the US, what about Canada? What is Canada's image when it comes to clean energy? Do people have globally, do they have a perception of us?
I think Canada's image out there is great. I mean, Canada is actually a delightfully normal, somewhat boring place to invest, which isn't a bad thing these days, I would argue. And I think Canada's image as a clean energy powerhouse is getting to be known. When new investors, and at Gowling WLG, we of course see new investors coming to Canada all the time. When they come to Canada, what are they looking for? They're looking for clean power solutions in almost any industry. Where do they land? They land in Quebec. They go to Manitoba. They go to British Columbia. Eventually, they might end up in Ontario. They're looking for a clean energy grid. Whether it's a data center or a manufacturing facility, ultimately they know that carbon is going to be a problem in the future.
Of course, in Alberta, we have a premier who has tried to restrict certainly the placement of some renewable energy projects. Yeah. Talking about preserving farmland for one thing. And in Ontario, we have a government that actually initially ripped out some wind installations. So has that turned off international investors, do you think?
You know, international investors are interested in the rule of law. Canada's really good at that. So people, every one of these cases eventually ends up in court. Often ends up in court, and investors look at the results. They look for independent judiciary. Of course, as a law firm, I might be feathering my own nest, but at the end of the day, all politics is local, and politicians will make their choices. Surprisingly, Alberta is seeing a lot of development, both in solar and in wind, and there is a lot of interest still in that market. And the Alberta government is making its own choices.
Yes, I mean, Alberta is a hotbed of wind in particular. Yeah, that's quite right.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very hard to predict what the new Republican administration will do in the United States, but will it have a big impact on the rollout of clean energy?
It's obviously, it's very hard to predict. I tend to ignore the midnight musings on social media personally, but at the end of the day, the U.S. government has to make its own choices. One thing that I've been surprised to learn over the past few months is people actually aren't expecting that much change to the Inflation Reduction Act. Why? Because over 80% of the benefits are going to Republican jurisdictions, and there's a lot of strong support. It might be rebranded, it might be renamed, it might be recast, certain bells and whistles might change, but at the end of the day, the general thrust of it isn't. People are saying it's not going to change. The other thing that's happening, Andrew, is the ship is turning in that cost really governs everything, and solar and battery costs just keep declining and declining on an exponential cost curve.
Sorry, I was going to say the current administration's massive investment in clean energy has often gone to Republican areas, apparently, because it's quicker to get the permits to build things.
That's right. That's right. And of course, you're seeing a lot of support coming from a number of supporters of the incoming president, who were one in particular who was one of the leading lights in the EV sector. So there's a conversation that's going on. At the same time, every year, solar panel prices go down 12% consistently, something called Swanson's Law, and battery prices go down 13% every year, year over year, for over 50 years. And so that's that continuing cost curve. And what's interesting about that is it's really hard for people, and particularly policymakers, to understand and really accommodate a declining cost curve, an exponential declining cost curve. That's a tough challenge for people. But if we think back to the electronics that we paid through the nose for in years gone by and what they're available for now, that's the way consumers can look at it. Yeah. And investors.
It's interesting. We're carrying around a computer in our pocket that 50 years ago would have taken up rooms.
Billions, yeah, it would have been billions of dollars. Absolutely, that's a great example. Yeah.
What about China? Where is it fitting? Because China fitting into this, because China has invested so heavily in clean energy technologies. They want to be dominant. Yeah,
so China has really good strategic reasons for investing in clean energy technologies, namely the Straits of Malacca and its access to oil and gas. So at the end of the day, China has invested in what we refer to, or what they've referred to for more than 10 years, as the big three: EVs, battery technology, and solar. And to the extent, and your viewers can do their own research on this, but to the extent that in these three categories, China is dominant. There's no doubt about it. China is actually making today more solar panels than the world actually installs on an annual basis, actually twice as much as the world installs on an annual basis. So China is absolutely dominant. What is that doing? That's driving the cost down. And so you're seeing massive competition in the Chinese market among producers of these technologies. And so all of us are beneficiaries, really, of these super low costs. And the costs are only continuing to go down. So.
We're tight for time, but of course, some people have condemned the protectionist measures adopted in Canada and the US and elsewhere to keep out Chinese electric cars, saying we won't be able to get carbon out of our transport system without these Chinese vehicles.
It's a fascinating discussion. At the end of the day, policymakers have to make their own choices. You and I are both old enough to remember the protectionist measures of the 1970s and 1980s here in North America, and the result in terms of the overall quality of the cars that were available to us in North America. At the end of the day, competition is generally a good thing in these markets. That being said, each government, of course, has to make its own decisions, and it's a highly competitive place out there. So.